So what is the argument from contingency, or better put, what are arguments from contingency, since there are various different arguments from contingency? If we understand the basic ideas and concepts involved, we can take a look at these different arguments and see how they differ from each other, why they differ from each other, and what strengths and weaknesses they have. The basic idea is, of course, that there are contingent facts. Facts that do obtain, but might have not obtained. The existence of ordinary objects like cars, trees, or dogs are such facts. Cars, trees, and dogs do exist, but they might have not existed. So it's true that dogs exist, but it might not have been true. Probably some million years ago dogs didn't exist, and yet now they do. So the truth value of the proposition dogs exist changed from false to being true. There are of course propositions that cannot be true. Married bachelors cannot exist, so the proposition married bachelors exist is necessarily false. On the other hand, the proposition 2 + 2 = 4 cannot be false. It holds true in all circumstances at all given times. 2 + 2 = 4 is necessarily true. But unlike propositions that are necessarily true or false, contingent proposition can be thought of as true or false dependent on various circumstances. But there is nothing about these propositions themselves that determines whether or not they are true. If they are true, then they are true because of external circumstances or for no reason at all. And this is where the argument from contingency comes into play. The argument rests on a principle called the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason. In its strongest form, this principle states that for every proposition P, if P is true, then there is a sufficient explanation for why P is true. If we then look at a contingent proposition like dogs exist, we see that they don't contain within themselves the reason for their own truth. Dogs cannot explain why dogs exist. So to sufficiently explain the truth of a contingent proposition, one has to appeal to at least one different proposition. But if we, in order to explain the truth of a contingent proposition, appeal to other contingent propositions, and then, to explain the truth of these contingent propositions, we again appeal to other contingent propositions, and so on, the buck never seems to stop. We will never arrive at an end to an explanatory chain unless we explain all our contingent propositions by a proposition that is not contingent. So, we search for an entity whose existence is not explained by some external facts. We search for something that exists due to its own nature, whose being is not dependent upon anything but itself. Arguments from contingency seek to establish that all contingent reality is to be explained by reference to a necessary being that bears the fundamental properties of the God of classical theism. Let us look at a formulation of the argument that seeks to capture the ideas of Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz. 1. Any contingent fact about the world must have an explanation. 2. It is a contingent fact that there are contingent facts. 3. The fact that there are contingent things can't be explained by any contingent things. 4. The fact that there are contingent things must have an explanation. 5. The fact that there are contingent things can't be explained by any contingent things. 6. The fact that there are contingent things must be explained by something whose existence is not contingent. 7. Therefore, there is a necessary being. This is a very basic type of contingency argument, but it already has a nice feature to it. It evades the possible objection that there might be infinitely many contingent things that in turn explain each other. For that may be so, but surely this doesn't explain why there are contingent facts in the first place. All contingent things themselves may be explained by other contingent things, but there is the larger question: why are there contingent things in existence in the first place? The core idea here is that things of a certain kind cannot explain why things of exactly this kind exist.
Now here's a suggestion. If there's an explanation for things of a certain kind, and it's contingent that there are things of that kind, that explanation has to appeal to something outside that kind. For example, if there's an explanation for the existence of elephants, it has to include some non-elephants. It can't be that the big elephant created all the little elephants, because you'd still have the big elephant to start with.
Thanks, Peter. That was the best kind of example I could think of. Of course, even if there were infinitely many elephants, this wouldn't explain why there are elephants in the first place. So even if we think of an infinite chain of contingent objects, each explaining each other, this wouldn't explain the existence of contingent facts themselves. In modern formulations of the argument, contingent facts or propositions are often no longer analyzed as distinct entities, but rather, they are analyzed as conjunctions. Philosophers talk about big contingent conjunctive facts, or BCCFs. And what they do is, they take all contingent propositions and construct a large proposition that simply includes them all. In the exact way the proposition dogs exist and the proposition cats exist can be expressed as dogs and cats exist, we can take all contingent facts of a world and construct a contingent proposition that includes all these facts. Philosopher Alexander Proust puts it like this: every contingent fact has an explanation. 2. There is a contingent fact that includes all other contingent facts. 3. Therefore, there is an explanation of this fact. 4. This explanation must involve a necessary being. 5. This necessary being is God. Now, there are 3 main objections to these kinds of arguments. The first is the denial of the principle of sufficient reason. Maybe there are facts or propositions that are contingent and yet simply lack any kind of explanation. These would be called brute facts. Maybe, for example, the universe exists for no reason at all. It might have not existed, but it does, and no reason can be given for why it does. It exists as a brute fact. The problem with this approach is that it's very unsatisfying and runs into severe problems when we contemplate the intelligibility of this proposal. It seems hard to accept that facts obtain for no reason at all, and from experience we know that the world we inhabit is intelligible and conforms to certain strict patterns, often called the laws of nature, that do seem to hold universally. It seems like the world is rationally ordered, which implies that facts do not obtain for no reason. A better objection would be the following. It seems hard to show a way in which a necessary proposition could explain a contingent proposition. If we think of an explanation as a set of propositions that logically entail the proposition to be explained, then the proposition cannot be a contingent proposition. Let us suppose, just for the sake of argument, that the following 2 propositions are necessary. God exists and God creates the universe. If these 2 propositions are necessary, meaning they cannot be false, then the proposition the universe exists cannot be false either, because it necessarily follows from the other 2. Now, if we look at a BCCF, our big conjunctive contingent fact, and we suppose that it is explained by a necessary being, then we may have been wrong to consider this fact, the BCCF, a contingent proposition in the first place. If this conjunction of facts is entailed by a necessary fact, then this big conjunctive fact may not be a contingent one. But is this actually the right approach? 2 explanations need to entail what they are supposed to explain. Suppose you see a neighbor working in the garden and you ask why this is so, and the answer is that he has a day off from work. Surely that is an explanation, but the fact that he has a day off doesn't entail that he is now working in the garden. But if we accept that explanations do not necessarily entail the explanatum, then we see that maybe a necessary proposition can explain a contingent one. Maybe the free decision of a necessary being can explain a conjunction of contingent proposition without entailing their truth. Further objection would be to question whether or not the necessary being in question really is something like the God of theism. Maybe this necessary entity is wholly apersonal. Maybe it's a purely physical entity devoid of will and intellect. This is what is normally called the gap problem. The difficulty of showing that the necessary being in question has a minimum of divine attributes. What the argument shows is that there is a necessary being that explains all the contingent facts about the world. It may be stated that a being that exists due to the necessity of its own nature satisfies the intuition behind the principle of sufficient reason that every fact has an explanation. In this sense, then, a divine agent that intentionally brought about the contingent facts in question while itself existing because of its very own nature seems to be a simple and elegant solution. Additionally, certain properties of the universe, such as the fine-tuning of the physical constants for the existence of embodied moral agents, may provide additional reason for accepting a theistic explanation here. More modern formulation of the argument make use of a more modest formulation of the principle of sufficient reason. There is what is called the Modal argument from contingency. It rests on a weaker premise that is harder to reject. 1. Necessarily, every maximal set of contingent facts possibly has an explanation. While one may reject the claim that sets of contingent facts do have explanations, it seems far-fetched to assert that it's impossible for them to be explained. The interesting fact here is that it is enough to accept that contingent facts can be explained to deduce that there exists a necessary being that explains them. In order to validly deduce this, philosophers make use of what is called S5, a system of modal logic that states that if something is possibly necessary, then it's necessary. Philosophers often analyze possibility in terms of possible worlds, maximal descriptions of the way the world could have been or could be. To say that something is possible is to say there exists a possible world in which it is true. Now, if the existence of a necessary being is possible, then that means there exists a possible world in which a necessary being exists. But a necessary being isn't a necessary being unless it exists in all possible worlds. And so, if a necessary being exists in some possible world, then it exists in all possible worlds. And now let's look at that premise again. Necessarily, every maximal set of contingent facts possibly has an explanation. If we add that a maximal set of contingent propositions cannot have an explanation that itself is contingent, 2. Necessarily, every maximal set of contingent facts possibly has an explanation in the form of a necessary being, and 3. There exists a maximal set of contingent facts, then we get 4. Possibly there exists a necessary being. And as we have seen, this entails 5. There exists a necessary being. So the much more modest claim that contingent states of affairs can have an explanation seems to suffice for a successful contingency argument. The exact same result was proven by Alexander Pruss and Richard Gale in a yet different version of the contingency argument. Their argument is very technical and complicated, but one can explain their reasoning in a simplified way and capture the essence of their thought. Let's say there is a big conjunctive fact, a proposition that includes all truth about the actual world, whether necessary or contingent. Now, within that big conjunctive fact, there is a big conjunctive contingent fact, the BCCF, the big fact that includes only contingent facts. Now, Pruss and Gale stated their weak version of the principle of sufficient reason as, possibly every fact of the actual world's BCF has an explanation. So if it's possible that the BCCF of the big contingent fact of the actual world has an explanation, then this means that there is a possible world, call it W1, that contains this BCCF and the explanation for the BCCF. Two worlds cannot differ in respect of their necessary propositions since they are always the same. And also, the BCCF of W1 cannot differ from the actual world's BCCF. Why? Because if a proposition in the actual world's BCCF is false, the BCCF contains the truth that it is false. So if such a proposition were true in W1's BCCF, it would include the proposition as being true in W1. But since W1's BCCF does include the actual world's BCCF, these propositions would then contradict each other. But a proposition cannot be both true and false in W1, so the BCCF of W1 is the same as the BCCF of the actual world. This means that stating that every proposition in the actual world can be explained is to imply that it is explained.